This is just part of our Building Sabbatical Culture series. Before we start, I'd like to do a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge the land we are on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We are mindful of broken covenants and strive to make this right with the land and with each other. So tonight, Rabbi Miriam is going to explain the context of Shmita, guide us through sources about debt and debt forgiveness in biblical and rabbinic periods, as well as how to ensure people keep lending money to those in need. She'll highlight the values that animate those laws. In response, our guest speaker, James Radner, will help us examine how these ancient laws and values might guide us towards greater economic equity and justice today. So before we start, let me tell you a bit about our guest speaker. Jamie teaches at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. He's a senior fellow at the Center on the Developing Child at Harvard, and he's research director of the True Point Center for Higher Ambition Leadership. He's worked in international development, community health, education and economic development organizations, as well as with Amnesty International. One of the courses he teaches is on international development, where central questions such as why so many people are in deep poverty and what can be done about that are examined. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to you, Rabbi Miriam.
Thank you so much, Sharon. And it's really wonderful to be here with our multi-faith partners. So welcome to everyone. It's delightful to be doing this learning together, learning of religious sources, of cultural and religious sources as a foundation for the work of justice and deep insight into our actions and our choices in the present. So in light of that engagement, I've put in the chat the blessing for engaging in Jewish learning. And it's a blessing that we say every day in Jewish life, because every day should be filled with opportunities for learning that guide and shapes our living. So please feel free to join with me. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. So a little bit of context. We are in a Shmita year in the Jewish calendar. According to the Hebrew calendar date, we're in the year 5782. And every 7 years, according to biblical law, is a Shmita year, a sabbatical year. The English word sabbatical is connected to Shmita. And some of the core practice we've been exploring over the course of this year, the traditional language and shaping of values of what Shmita is and what it's seeking to cultivate in our world, in our lives. And we've been exploring different ways of applying the teachings of Shmita, different ways of living them in contemporary life. So as a bit of overview, I want to say that the practices of Shmita include letting the land lie fallow every 7 years, which means no planting, no cultivating, taking only what the wild earth yields. It's described as a Shabbat for the land and a Shabbat for Adonai, for the divine. Very interesting. We did some exploring of that in one of the previous sessions. And if it's in the context of an agrarian society, if we're letting the land lie fallow, then that also means that we, all who labor, who work to cultivate and grow crops, are also in a time of fallowness and rest. It's also spoken about in terms of relinquishing ownership of the land. So not only do we cease from actively working the land so that it yields. But those who own land and those who don't own land become equal. In one traditional source, it even says that fences were taken down during the sabbatical year, and everyone came and took what they needed. Everyone was fed. And finally, the piece that we're going to focus on today is that every 7 years, in every Shmita year, debts were forgiven. We're going to explore what that means. But I want us to hold the full picture of relationship to the earth, relationship to our labor, relationship to what we consume and what we produce, and relationship financially to having and lacking, and how we support each other, and how economic vulnerability is framed. So the first source that I want us to take a look at, and it's worth saying because it may not be a shared assumption, that right at the heart of what we do in the process of Jewish learning is to look at ancient wisdom and read it through contemporary eyes. I love thinking about the fact that we don't need to be, and also can't be, brilliant enough in one lifetime to know everything that there is to know and think about everything there is to think about. So we are blessed with the gift of a rich tradition of deep thinking and the development of thought and orientation of heart, mind, body, and spirit as an integrated whole, and a commitment to living with those in an integrated way. And we get to receive that inheritance and then continue to engage in processes of interpretation, questioning and challenging, as well as being challenged by our sources. So a couple quotations to frame us a little bit, and then we'll go into a deep dive into Deuteronomy. Try saying that 5 times fast. Deep dive into Deuteronomy, deep dive. Okay, I won't. But from the Babylonian Talmud, a body of law and discussion that was codified in the year approximately 500 of the Common Era. One who lends money is greater than one who performs charity, and one who forms a partnership is greater than all. And from contemporary professor Suzanne Last Stone, she's a professor of Jewish law at Cardozo Law School at Yeshiva University. She writes, Shmita is part of a complex of ideas in the Bible that essentially promote a socioeconomic vision in which people are given second chances to start over again, in which they might change their economic and social position. It's kind of like a reboot economically. So I want those to just sort of echo, to stay with us as we take a look at Sefer Dvarim, the book of Deuteronomy, starting with chapter 15, verse 1. At the end of every 7th year, you shall practice a Shmita. The word Shmita means a letting go, a year of release. You shall practice letting go. I just love that as a translation. Contextually, here it means remission of debts. So at the end of every 7th year, you shall practice a remission of debt. This shall be the nature of the Shmita. Every creditor shall release the due that he claims from his fellow. He shall not exact it of his fellow or kin, because Adonai's release has been proclaimed. You may exact it of the foreigner, but you must release whatever is due from your kin. So pausing here, first of all, it's important to acknowledge biblical language assumes everybody's male. We know that all genders are included in this. I'm going to change the language as I read it, but I think it's important to see the text in the original. I want us to note that this releasing of debts, this remission of debts that we're going to be exploring, happens at the end of every 7th year. So the community has lived together through the practices of Shmita, of relinquishing ownership of our fields, sharing crops. If you didn't have a field, you get to partake freely. It's been a year of relating to each other in new ways. And then here comes at the end of it, relinquishing debts. Every creditor shall release the due that they have a claim for their fellow. And I want us to notice that why? Because Adonai proclaimed this release, which is one way of saying it's bigger than your individual desires or compulsions or insecurities. A source greater than you has declared, let go, let go, let go. And you may exact it of the foreigner. So if a foreigner, somebody who's coming through, borrows money from you, stays for a while, the Shmita year begins, or the Shmita year comes to its end, sorry. The foreigner still owes that money to you, but your kin, those who dwell with you, those you create community with on an ongoing basis, this is a different kind of relationship. Every 7 years, whatever you owe someone is forgiven, whatever they owe you is forgiven. Then the text continues, there shall be no needy among you. What a verse. There shall be no needy among you. I find it so powerful that right there is a values assertion to aspire toward. We'll see in a moment that they also deal with reality. But right there shall be no needy among you, since Adonai your God will bless you in the land that Adonai your God is giving you as a hereditary portion. If only you heed Adonai your God and take care to keep all this instruction that I enjoin upon you this day. Here I want us to notice that there's a set of relationships being created, that anything that you have, this verse is saying, be aware that you have it because you have been blessed. That it comes from Adonai. It's not actually yours, but it is in a way lent to you, bequeathed to you on condition. And what's the condition? If you heed Adonai your God and take care to keep all this instruction, which I think is another way of saying there's a whole system of moral, social, spiritual commitments you are obligated to. And in order to participate in the bounty of whatever it is that you receive, it is in relationship with a whole host of responsibilities and obligations. For Adonai your God will bless you as God has promised you. You will extend loans to many nations, but require none yourself. You will dominate many nations, but they will not dominate you. Interesting framing of a sense of, in this ideal, we, the Israelites, the Jewish people, will be in a position to be able to be generous, but we will not be in need. And it's from a position of strength. If, however, there is a needy person among you, that's interesting, just to take a look. We went from there shall be no needy among you to what? If there is a needy person among you, here's what you do. If there is a needy person among you, one of your kin in any of your settlements in the land that Adonai your God is giving you, do not harden your heart and shut your hand against your needy kin. Rather, you must open your hand. The Hebrew is beautiful. Patoach tiftach et yadecha. Open your hand and lend them sufficiently for whatever they need. I want us to note here, very interesting language. In Torah, in generally, our sages say there is no superfluous word. So what does it mean when it says, first, don't harden your heart, don't shut your hand, open your hand. Our sages ask, wouldn't it have been enough to just say, open your hand? You see your needy kin, open your hand. But right away, it's understanding human nature and our impulses to close, to hold on to what is mine, to be protective, to be worried, will I have enough for retirement? What if I meet insecurity tomorrow? So asking us to practice, do not harden your heart, do not shut your hand against your needy kin, and open. Beware, lest you harbor the base thought, the 7th year, the year of remission, is approaching, so that you are mean to your needy kin and give them nothing. What's going on here? So if you know that there's a practice that every 7 years, every Shmita year, all debts are forgiven, if you have the means, if you have the resources, you might be inclined to not give in the 7th year, because it's very likely you won't get it back. So beware lest you harbor this base thought, so that you are mean to your needy kin and give them nothing. They will cry out to Adonai against you, and you will incur guilt. Give to them readily and have no regrets when you do so. For in return, sorry for the spelling mistake, Adonai, your God, will bless you in all your efforts and in all your undertakings. For there will never cease to be needy ones in your land, which is why I command you, open your hand to the poor and needy kin in your land. So we went from there shall be no needy, then to if there is among you a needy person, to this statement in verse 11 that I find striking and painful and real. There will never cease to be needy people. We live in a world where one person's crops grow and another person's fail, where things happen that are beyond our control. And there's an awareness in the text that there is a permanent obligation to see where there is need and to respond to it in relationship with community. And I want to hold that as a thought, because later on when Jamie is speaking, I think we'll be thinking in more global terms, at least for part of the conversation. So I want us to notice that in the biblical framing, it's very local. It's very much about the people that you live with and are in ongoing relationship with. So I want to hold that as a challenge and question for us. I want to read one more section from Deuteronomy and then hear some of your thoughts. Or all your thoughts. We'll see what we have time for. So then the section continues. If a fellow Hebrew, man or woman, is sold to you, they shall serve you 6 years, and in the 7th year you shall set them free. When you set them free, do not let them go empty-handed. Furnish them out of the flock, threshing floor, and vat, with which Adonai your God has blessed you. Bear in mind that you were slaves in the land of Egypt, and Adonai your God redeemed you. Therefore I enjoin this commandment upon you today. So here we're talking about slavery, or really I would say indentured servitude, flowing with what came before, that in a context in which most of the cases where somebody would borrow money would be, for example, for seed to plant, and borrowing money for the seed and being able ideally to pay it back once there's a harvest. But what happens if you have a bad harvest? You don't have the money to pay the loan back. When the next planting season comes, you need to purchase seed again. So you have the debt plus you have a loan, and there begins the cycle of poverty. And historically, as well as in contemporary times in certain contexts, if one cannot pay one's debt, selling oneself into indentured servitude or one's family member is the only option, was the only option. And so here there's an additional framing of not only will debts be forgiven every 7 years, but the situation of owning another human being will last only as long as 7 years. And you need to let them go free with resource. So I want to pause here and hear some thoughts, reactions, questions.
The first thing I thought of was my first reaction was to the very first quote you read about how giving someone a loan is better than giving charity. And I have to say, our modern life doesn't seem to support that. It is so much easier for people who don't have enough to just be given a grant as opposed to work hard to pay it off. And it is my belief that the thoughts about, at least modern thoughts about borrowing or lending money versus giving money, come from a belief that poor people became that way through our own fault. And so that we need managing by the people who have money, who are clearly more mature and better at adulting, and that they will help us grow some sort of inner discipline by making us pay the money back. They don't, this structure, of course, completely doesn't acknowledge like intergenerational class stuff as well as disability. And so I have a profound opposition to the belief that lending money is better than giving money. I do like somewhere else in the Talmud, I think, or anyway, rabbinic writings, there is something about how, the tiers of giving. And how the more anonymized the giving is, the better it is. And I do subscribe to that. I think that it creates much more obligation if you know who you're giving money to and they know who you are. And if it's possible to do that anonymously, then I think it's awesome. But I do think that for poor people, giving is being given money outright is much more preferable to a loan.
Great, thank you. I think that's a really important way of extending the text into a contemporary context. In the Torah's imagination and I think vision of reality, there is no intergenerational poverty. That in this system, it is erased every it is re-leveled every 7 years, so that there doesn't become a situation in one's own lifetime or passing it on of poverty becoming something that is systemic. And here we are in a reality where it is. And I think you raise a very important point about disability as well. The text seems to be assuming that everybody is equally capable of working in similar ways to earn their livelihood. And people occasionally have setbacks in which it's the responsibility of the community to help them along. And thank you very much for your insights and comments. Other thoughts? Seems pretty radical to me. I want to take us, Jamie, please jump in.
Well, I agree. I think it is radical. I was just wondering in the text there, several references to kin. You must remit whatever is due from your kin, and your kin among you. If one of your kin, what does that mean?
Great. Excellent question. Thank you. In this particular framing, they're talking about fellow Israelites, as well as any what's called ger or ger toshav, non-Israelite people who have become part of your community. Very DJC, I think. Our Jewish members and our members from other backgrounds and traditions. If you've stepped in, you are part of this community, even in ancient times. And so those people are considered your kin, as opposed to a different nation, like who lives as their separate collective, or foreigners coming through. So there's a sense that you are living together, building together, experiencing moments of vulnerability, seeing each other, and in ongoing relationship with each other. That's what's meant by kin here. Jamie, do you want to comment? Should I keep going through the sources and then turn it? Okay. So I want to take a look at a few other sources that raise some questions about this as a practice. So let's take a look. Okay, so now we turn to the Mishnah, the earliest source of rabbinic law, commentary on the Torah, and taking it in new directions. So these were oral rabbinic teachings that were codified, pulled together in the Mishnah around the year 200 of the Common Era. So some commentary on Shmita. The sabbatical year cancels a debt written in a document or one not written in a document. So interesting. Worth noting that a debt can be verbal. If we have an agreement of loan and debt, it doesn't have to be formalized in a written document. Now here we have some discussion around not all debts being equal. Not all debts are the same. A debt to a shop is not canceled, but if it had been converted into the form of a loan, then it is canceled. Rabbi Judah said the former debt is always canceled. I love it. The rabbis always have to disagree. But it's good that we hear a majority opinion and minority opinion. A wage debt to a worker is not canceled. So in other words, if I worked for you and you don't have the money to pay me today, you owe me money, there's a debt, that's not canceled in the Shmita year. But if it had been converted into a loan, it is canceled. So again, there's relationship, there's choice, there's agreement. Is this a debt that should stand? Or are we agreeing that the debt has been shifted into I am hereby loaning you money, or you are loaning me money, and then it's a different kind of agreement? Rabbi Yossi says the payment for any work that must cease in the 7th year is canceled. But if it need not cease in the 7th year, then it is not canceled. So if it's work, let's say, related to cultivating your field, then the payment is canceled because the work doesn't continue. Number 2, fines for rape, for seduction, for defamation, for all other obligations arising from legal procedure are not remitted. Very important. When there is an issue of somebody being liable and owing damages for a criminal act, that's not forgiven in the sabbatical year. One who loans and takes a pledge, and one who hands over his debts, their debt documents to a court, these debts are not remitted. Now here's an interesting one. A loan secured by a prosbul is not canceled. So I just want to note this term prosbul is derived from the Greek and it means delivery. This, we're going to see in just a moment, is a legal bait and switch, a legal maneuver so that debts are not canceled in the 7th year. So we've just heard all of this framing of canceling debts in the Torah, and here Hillel enacted something called a prosbul to erase that. This was one of the things enacted by Hillel the elder for when he observed people refraining from lending to one another, and thus transgressing what is written in the Torah. Beware lest you harbor a base thought. The 7th year, the year of remission, is approaching, so that you are mean to your needy kin and give them nothing. Hillel enacted the prosbul. This is the formula of the prosbul. I turn over to you so and so, judges of such and such a place, that any debt that I may have outstanding, I shall collect it whenever I desire, and the judges sign below or the witnesses. So there is, out of concern that people will stop lending money to those who need it. Hillel the Elder said it's actually more important that people with wealth continue to lend money to those who need it, and erase this whole remission of debts thing than it is to observe the practice of forgiving debts. Let's hold that as what are the values of which? One who returns a debt after the 7th year, the creditor must say to the debtor, I remit it. But the debtor should say, even so, I will repay it. The creditor may then accept it from them because it says, and this is the word of the release. So if you want to pay the money back, and you can pay the money back, even though it's been forgiven, you can still say, I want to pay you back. And the person you owe the money to has to say, but it's been forgiven. And you can say, but I want to give it back to you. And there you go. Let's pause for a moment there. What are the pluses and minuses, the pros and cons of holding a system where debts are forgiven every 7 years versus one in which we let go of that? We use the prose bowl so that people continue to lend money. Or if there are other threads in there that you want to reflect on. Camila?
Well, I mean, what about a third option?
Yes.
I know someone who says, I never lend my friends money. If I have money to lend, I just give it to them outright. And I'm thinking, what about that? What about when it gets close to the Shmita, instead of using a prosible or seeing people just not lending money, what if there's an encouragement to have wealthy people give money away to poor people who need it? I really like that plan.
And that becomes the system later, that by the Middle Ages, there's much more of a focus on the requirements of tzedakah. I don't like the translation of the word charity.
I know.
The word tzedakah contains the word tzedek, justice.
Mm-hmm.
So giving in a just way. So framing our obligation in terms of how do I share, if I have means, what is just in terms of ensuring that everybody has what they need. So I think that's a beautiful framing and suggestion. I'm wondering if anybody wants to reflect on why would there be value in encouraging people to lend money rather than just give it? I have a mortgage. Nobody's giving me that money. Not exactly need-based, but it's interesting that there are a lot of ways in which people need loans today, not necessarily we're not necessarily talking in this example about basic needs, but a dynamic in which a loan is very helpful to lift up and enable people to do certain things. Jamie?
Oh, I could offer an example. It's not without its flaws and controversy, but again in the international development space, microcredit, where you often have groups of villagers receiving very small loans and then paying them back, and it helps them get started with something or get over a hurdle. And if you ask, what's the advantage if you imagined that whoever financed the little loan might also be able to have financed a little grant? I think the idea is that there are many, many, many more resources, because if these folks can generally use the money to do something productive with it and pay it back, then more money is available for people in the next village, or maybe even people in my village who also need a loan. And the thing cycles. And microfinance has been quite successful at growing on that model, at funds flowing through and then being used again and then again and again. So that's a possible reason. So long as you don't get into injustice with repayment. So it's a complicated question, but it's a possible reason from the point of view of, if I want to make resources that I have that are finite available to fight poverty to the most benefit, the idea that they be shared, used for a while by someone and then used for a while by someone else, then used for a while by someone else, is the idea of microfinance.
I think actually, Jamie, this might be a good moment. If there are some general introductory remarks that you want to make in terms of contemporary life, or any economic terms that would be valuable to explain, and then other applications. I thought, the microloans is such a valuable example. I wonder if there are others that you'd like to reflect on. Why don't you bust into your broader presentation?
And then then we can return.
Yeah.
Then we can return. Well, it is going to be a little bit of a leap, as you already pointed out, Rabbi Miriam. And I've been feeling this keenly too, looking at these texts, from a set of practices and rules, a system designed in effect for a small agricultural community, a pretty contained community of kinspeople, as you defined it for us a couple of millennia ago. And now I'm thinking about possible applications of this way of viewing things in a very different world. It is, for one thing, a world where our economic and social relations aren't confined to a small agricultural community, very few of us. And this is brought home to us in many ways. It's certainly true economically, with the kind of cliche of globalization. But the pandemic has certainly brought that home about as powerfully as it could be. Someone contracts a variant somewhere thousands of miles away, and that variant, if it has certain conditions, shows up infecting the human family all over the world, and quickly. And no matter how many travel restrictions you put in, or that's what happens. We're connected now in a way that we weren't before. But I'm also, it so happens that my work is primarily in international development. I don't make a sharp distinction between economic justice close to home and far away. And I have done and continue to do projects domestically here as well. Because I think we both read domestically, and our cousins abroad have much to learn from each other. And I do think, I'm trying to say, we're one human family. But the work that I do has not really been informed, frankly, over the years by this idea of Shmita, because I barely, I knew from way back, this idea of the 7 sabbatical year. I'd forgotten if I ever knew that it was called Shmita, and then the 49-50 Jubilee year. I knew that existed, but just thought of it as something from the past. I do draw an approach to my work from the Tikkun Olam tradition, healing the world. The idea that our world is somehow shattered, it's fractured and suffering pain from a kind of separation, and that it is our collective work, part of our collective work anyway, to try to put it together, to heal that fracture. A task which, as Rabbi Tarfon illuminatingly reminded us, a task we will not finish. It's not for us to finish that, but nor can we refrain from it. That's a Jewish source for me in my international draft, not Shmita. So then I remember on Yom Kippur, a very powerful sermon about the Shmita Year, which introduced the Shmita Year in a different way for me. And then seeing and hearing this material that you've offered, Rabbi Miriam, it did get me thinking. And I think there are a lot of connections. They're naturally going to be connections by analogy, and they're not tight, but I think they can enrich our thinking about economic justice. So what I thought I'd do is just try to offer a few connected to areas of work that I've either been involved in or colleagues have over the years. Just a few links without trying. The topic of worldwide or even Canadian economic justice is far too big and deep to try to cover in a little short comment on Shmita. So I'm not going to try to do that, but I'd rather just bring to life a few examples and see what people think of it and see whether it stimulates people's thinking. So first, maybe a powerful one for me anyway, from the past. Pandemics have long been with us, but one of the most ferocious pandemics of my lifetime certainly was and is, because it's still going, the AIDS pandemic. We just go back in time a little bit from our current coronavirus pandemic. So what happened with AIDS was it was virtually a death sentence until the development of a remarkable set of drugs called protease inhibitors, which when delivered in a cocktail were very effective at controlling the virus, not curing it. So it became a chronic but livable condition, which is a remarkable transformation. I guess we all, probably everyone on this call, lived through it and watched the change, people coming back to life even almost. Really, it was extraordinary, marvelous things. But you needed them, you needed to take them every day for the rest of your life, and they were expensive. So it cost about $10,000 to $15,000 per patient per year for one of these, for a course of treatment. That's, $10,000 to $15,000 a year to stay alive. And well, here in the rich countries, our health systems could afford that for the relatively small number of people who had AIDS, so they could do it, and people got it here, and people in poor countries couldn't. And you had this powerful injustice rooted in our economic system, and this crescendo of international death, even as the virus was being contained in the rich countries. It reached nearly 2 million people dying a year. And young people at that. So here's a thought related to Shmita. There was an economic system that this was responding to, like a system of land ownership and a system of debt, as a way to sustain an economy. In this case, the idea was that in order to sustain development of new drugs, research and development of drugs and innovation in drugs, something profoundly valuable that created these life-saving drugs in the first place. In order to sustain that, it was necessary to give a patent to the developers, to the inventors, in this case, the big drug companies, so they could sell it at high prices, way above the cost. The production costs were on the order of $100 a year, not $10,000 or $15,000. There's an enormous difference. But then again, the invention costs were high. So that was the system that it encouraged people, a little bit like a advance payment loan. It encouraged people to put in very large sums of money doing the necessary research, knowing they could get large profits later if they found a drug that was safe and effective. And so I remember being engaged in this back in the 90s. The drugs came out in 1996, and there was an immense pretty soon. International controversy over the fact that these were being denied, in effect, to the less rich countries around the world. And people who were connected with the pharmaceutical industry, a pretty powerful notion that, well, this is a property right we have. You can't just take this away. But the Shmita idea is, okay, yes, there are property rights, but property rights aren't to be conceived as these permanent things that you hold forever, come what may. The idea that you first offered, Rabbi Miriam, that they're kind of, you're a custodian of the property right as part of a system, and the system has to respect justice. It has to respect also the needs of, in this case, I would say, the human family. So you need to make an exception. It was clear that there needed to be an exception. Justice demanded an exception, and countries like Brazil, India, Thailand, and South Africa started beating the drums. South Africa, under Nelson Mandela, began simply making the things, and they immediately got sued. You know, you're taking our property rights. But it wasn't just some countries doing this. There were also, here in Canada, with Médecins Sans Frontières, there was an NGO coalition that was worldwide, pressing governments who the rich governments tended to, and the big international institutions at the beginning tended to sympathize with the intellectual property. Those are ownership rights. And eventually it broke through. By 2001, it took between 4 and 5 years, so a terrible toll. But eventually what happened was everybody came around. The drug companies changed and developed a much, much lower pricing system for international distribution in low-income countries of these drugs, while still maintaining the high price in the rich world. And the International World Trade Organization developed an emergency exception that allowed people to produce these drugs generically, which in turn drove down the prices, and you started getting, $65 a year. And this has saved millions of lives. There are now very nearly 30 million people today are on these drugs, and their variants and descendants and cousins are continuing over the year. So you could say there was a serious delay in adopting what I would call the Shmita principle, but that something worked out here, something valuable happened. The idea that we shouldn't cleave dogmatically to property rights and to economic systems, which may indeed have value, but we need to be able to see when exceptions are necessary, and that really does apply to all of us, I think. That's an example. Moving on, just fast forwarding a little bit in this roughly the same space. Another thing that whole experience then led to was the development of the so-called medicine patent pool internationally, which enabled a international nonprofit funded by taxes on your air tickets, by the way, to license medicines. And that's coming into play today where we have the COVID pandemic. You might think that with many reforms like that, and like what I just described, a change to the system incorporating maybe Shmita style ideas. So were we ready to do better and serve all of humanity better when a patently global new pandemic hit? And the answer, sadly, is not really, not enough, not much. Because we've seen this extraordinary injustice frighteningly repeat itself. There have been about 11, but once again, we have this remarkable, it is remarkable, the development of these vaccines. We have a wonderful life-saving medicine, in this case, of preventive medicine. And we've put now the world something on the order of 11 billion of them, these doses, into people's arms. But where have they gone? Both in time and in space, they were grabbed by the wealthy countries who could afford to pay large sums to pharmaceutical companies. In Africa today, the distribution still tends to be maybe 20% or below. Even in rich countries, there's a sharp gradient by income because of various accessibility challenges. So we have worldwide vaccine inequality of very harsh dimensions, and that's allowed this killer to grow and spread, partly to create variants that come back on everybody, but partly the latest. It's not so easy to know the toll of COVID-19 because we don't have worldwide the kind of medical records that would enable it. I work a lot in India, and it's been devastating there. Recorded mortality is about 4 million excess deaths. Maybe 18 million worldwide, something like that, and very heavily in places like India and Africa. So it's at a cost. The fact that we did not get our act together. We had some things. The COVAX International Facility, there was an effort, still stalled, to enable generic production. The Oxford team that developed what became known as the AstraZeneca vaccine intentionally developed it for worldwide use rather than profit. And so when they needed a pharmaceutical company to do, once they had created the formula, they needed a pharmaceutical company to do the development, production, and distribution. And so they put out a call, and they made pretty strict conditions that it couldn't be used for profit. It had to be sold at cost in developing countries. And AstraZeneca accepted, and it had to allow licensing. AstraZeneca accepted those conditions, which is how they got the license. And the vaccine has done a great deal of good. It's finally been very effectively ramped up in India due to production there, for example, under these licensing arrangements. And it's partly from those arrangements and other reasons too. We have a capacity now to produce about 18 billion of these vaccines a year, COVID vaccines. We stop and think the world could produce only about 5 billion vaccines of any kind, for child vaccinations and before COVID hit. And then in addition to those ordinary 5 billion, now we're producing 18 billion more. That really is enough to vaccinate everybody and give them two and give them the boosters. It's enough, but we're drastically behind the curve actually doing it because it creates resources, it requires resources to use that production capacity to distribute through the cold chain, the logistics, and get these vaccines into people's arms. It's doable. We know how to vaccinate worldwide. We know how to produce delivery systems for vaccinations. We've done it a lot in my field, but the resources have flowed only to this moderate extent. So once again, you have a world community that has set up a set of ownership and control rights that have worked from the point of view of creating incentives to produce vaccines, but have not worked for economic justice. And the Shmita analysis, to me, says we've got to overturn the system. And so we've got to think more radically about who gets access to resources here when there's a pandemic. One quick note on that. There's another thing that Pfizer did. They created a rather remarkable seeming small molecule therapeutic called Paxlovid, which, if it could again be made widely available, it could be quite remarkable. It doesn't depend like the vaccines on the immune system, so it can help immunocompromised people. And it isn't dependent on the spike protein where there's all this evolution in the variants, which doesn't mean it's variant proof. It just means that right now it looks strong quite broadly. And it seems to have roughly 90% efficacy. That's a very, very powerful thing. And it doesn't cost a lot to produce either. So it sounds really good, but it does require production and distribution again. So you've got the same challenge. And again, what is happening? Rich countries are buying it up again. It's just the same. I feel like the Shmita has a system whereby every 7 years it's got a method for preventing this injustice from just building up and repeating it. We do not have that worldwide. The patent medicine pool that I described that came out after AIDS did jump into play here. And Pfizer has licensed, it was just recently announced, has licensed this into the pool. And there's some 35 or so, I don't know the exact number, international companies, and this is in the developing world, that have now have licenses via this pool. And if you're a low-income country, you do not have to pay any royalties. So it is set up now. Most of them are actually Indian. They're in India. India is remarkable as a manufacturer of drugs. So we've got this fabulous resource, the ability of India to make drugs. If only we had, even in this case, actually mobilized resources so they could ramp up production quickly, maybe the whole world would be better off. What's happening in Paxlovid isn't terrible. It's good to see these licensing agreements come into place because it takes a long time for production to ramp up. Where is the pool of resources? Why aren't those who control big medical resources like the pharmaceutical companies and the international community generally with its aid resources, why aren't they mobilizing with a sense of urgency, given that this virus is still deadly? Anyway, make a transition to a couple more things, and then I need to stop. One of the other things that happened in COVID, and I've been quite directly involved in it, not only makes people, unfortunately, it creates sickness and death. It also has had enormous economic consequences because of lockdowns and other restrictions put in place to try to save lives. The rich countries poured trillions of dollars into propping up in one way or another. Again, you can ask economic justice questions and equity questions. I think there's some very strong ones here. Why wasn't there more sick leave offered? Why were so-called essential workers not given an exceptional arrangement, far better? It's certainly a Shmita type emergency, I would say. But nevertheless, very large sums of money were poured into keeping some semblance of flotation of people's economic lives in the rich countries. Elsewhere, where countries are in fact indebted to rich countries, there was no such flow of resources. Much, much, much less was available and spent. And you have horrendous poverty. You have people sinking into hunger and food insecurity. You have terrible losses around the world as a result of this. And again, why didn't we kind of change our way of doing business, recognizing that this happened? There was a piece of it, and maybe the Shmita gives us a way of thinking about that. One thing the rich world did do was suspend or forgive debt. That's part of why this came to mind. They did do that. And so fewer debt payments from poor countries to rich countries, including China, by the way, which is a rich country in this connection. It lends a lot of money, especially to Africa. And China agreed to suspend. So you had maybe a reduction, something on the order of $11 billion. But think of that compared to the trillions. It's too small. It's something. So the principle is okay. Idea that some exception needs to be made. We can't just keep doing business as usual, but we need to be able to think big enough. I want to make the suggestion that this every 7 years and then the Jubilee 49 years is a way of thinking big enough for the problem. We need to be able to think big enough for the problem. I'll go one or two maybe more places with this, and just point out that there is a movement to forgive poor countries debt in general. For example, one of the leading NGO, probably the leading NGO, is the Debt Jubilee Organization. Wow. So they got that word from, that word has the biblical origin, the Jubilee idea. So this idea is being applied more directly in the context of rich and poor countries around forgiving debt. And there was a major initiative to forgive the debt of so-called highly indebted poor countries that, with the turn of the millennium, and has still been running. That was financed in significant part by the sale of gold from the IMF. I wonder if you had every 7 years a sale of gold or something so you could start forgiving debts. I would just makes you think, okay, something on the order of 86 billion. That's bigger than 11, but it's still small. It's still not big enough compared to the problem, which runs in hundreds of billions. But the debt jubilee idea is that countries can get in debt, just as you were saying, Rabbi Miriam, about individuals. A country which ends up in hardship because of the colonial experience, because of slavery, because of all kinds of historical events, or because of a natural disaster or a sequence of natural disasters. Lots of things can happen. And I think that's what the 7-year Shmita is also reminding you. Things can happen to people. Things can happen to countries. You get in debt, and if it's too deep, it becomes a perpetuating cycle, and you get this perpetuation of poverty. And the idea of Shmita in this connection and of the debt jubilee movement is to forgive that. That has been given, I'll come to my last area because I need to stop, but that's been given particular salience by the debt jubilee movement in connection with climate change, another major international problem of our time, of course, global problem of our time, in a way in which we're connected, another one like pandemics in which we're connected. So there's an argument that says that climate finance ought to be grant rather than debt. And indeed that even the word grant may not be a good way to describe what's happening when a society like our own, which has down the decades put all this carbon into the atmosphere, now engages with a society that did not do that because they were poor, right? But wants to develop and is going to instead entering here in the 21st century, a world where it's a big problem if you develop the way the rich countries already did develop. And not only that, but because of where most tropical countries are, the impact of global climate change is much fiercer. So there's a school of thought, I was very much engaged in this in my work, that says there's actually an obligation, this network of obligations of Shmita, some of them seeming a little bit paradoxical. There's actually an obligation here from the existing industrial countries to other countries to provide support to adapt to climate change and to grow their economies in climate-friendly ways, because the other ways are no longer available to them. There's an argument that it should not be thought of as a grant at all, and to say nothing of that, it shouldn't be a loan. In the real world, there are grants and loans that are done on this, and it's a complicated picture. I was involved in designing and working on some of it, and I want to offer two examples that I think bring in the Shmita, let's do this differently model a little bit, and suggest there can be new things under the sun and more radical thinking is certainly in order. So I'll say them pretty quickly now. One is that the way that instead of the funds being given in classic international development terms, where the donor country, either individually or through a multilateral group like the World Bank, basically sets the terms and says, we'll give you money if you use it on these conditions and you have to report back to us, or we'll lend you money and then you have to report back to us. And the money, the granting decision or the funding decision is in the control of the rich. The funds that have been established have dual control. They are run now by boards of directors who are 50-50, donor countries and recipient countries, rich countries and poor countries. And the way it works is that to do things, you have to have a consensus across them. I've been part of this effort. It's very interesting. It creates a different ownership relationship. So these funds are no longer, back to Shmita challenging ownership. They're no longer really owned by the donors the way they were before. And that's something new under the sun. I worked on this also very specifically. I was involved in the general effort, but also very specifically in grants to Indigenous peoples. In this case, when we're talking about climate change, to protect their livelihoods and their way of preserving and living with and in forests, which are a major carbon sink, so they're very important to the climate. And here there was no question of loans. So the money went as a grant. And how is this question of, quote, ownership that I was talking about before? Who gets to decide who gets the money? The rich countries did agree to put money into a fund, but how is that fund controlled? And we sorted out a way to do it with Indigenous communities controlling the funds. We had to create a mechanism and kind of a constitution for this, a way for the funds to flow. And to try to bring to life how we did that, I'll just paint a quick scene for you. Normally, in these kinds of international funds, just as in any big international deliberation, like the UN or whatever, what happens is people sit around the table, they're delegates sitting around a table, and they all have tent cards in front of them, Canada, the UK, South Africa, and they're people, but they have these tent names. And they're around the table making decisions. And then in the back are a group of observers who may or may not have the right to ask questions afterwards or make comments. So ordinarily, that's how it works in the climate funds too. Representatives, for example, of Indigenous people are in the back, and around the table are these countries. So what I did was I created an alternative model where in the center of the table were the Indigenous peoples, and the country representatives and the World Bank and the big international players were asked to sit in the back and make comments on the same rules, but just in reverse, and we started with a spiritual invocation offered by one of the Indigenous leaders. And we developed the Constitution. It eventually had to be agreed by everyone, including the donors, otherwise the money couldn't flow. But we developed the Constitution in that format. It was kind of a flip of, a kind of a Shmita style reversals. I thought it was very powerful. Many people noted upon it. I honor everybody who agreed to do it, both sides. I think the Shmita, I was saying to the rabbi my last comment, I think one of the ways Shmita challenges us is to look for the best in those who have the resources too, as opposed to demonizing them. Try to say, yeah, you can be part of a different moral community, a different way of conceiving justice. And you don't have to give up everything that you own in order to do it. You don't have to have no retirement, no resources, no land. You just have some mechanisms that reflect the other side, reflect the need of the human family project. So I'll stop there. Sorry for going on as long as I did.
No, that was excellent. Thank you so much, Jamie. I want to open it up for questions and comments from folks. And by the way, what you said at the end, I couldn't have said it better myself. So the framing of Shmita and those values. Polly.
I just wanted to say, Jamie, when you were saying in the example of climate change, the rich countries who caused the problem in large part, granting money to poorer countries who are suffering as a result. In a sense, you could look at it. You say, should it be called a grant? Well, it just occurred to me, it's a debt we have to them. I mean, it's like we're indebted to them for having messed up their country. So I just want to throw that out. It's another way to name what the actual relationship is. So,
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
This has really been interesting, Jamie. So thank you so much for your insights. And where I'm struggling is right at the beginning when Rabbi Miriam, we started and talked about debt. And I think metaphorically. So that helps me grapple with the complexity of an issue that we're talking about. And so where I'm struggling is when we talk about rich and poor countries, we talk about who we see, who's visible, who do we know is in need, whatever that means, whether it's financial or something else. And the notion, and Jamie, you mentioned equity, but there's so many people within the countries that we live in that are invisible. And as you started to use the pandemic as an example, it's a phenomenal opportunity for us to unpack what's happened and using the language of Shmita, which is sharing in my language, this is my interpretation. And the notion of debt, it's not monetary, there's something else for me. And how do we engage in that conversation and actually talk about things like power and control and in whose best interest are decisions being made and what is the goal? So we talk about rich countries, poor, but within those, who's hidden and who do we not talk about that exists? And those are the folks, because Canada is a wealthy country, we're still not seeing a whole bunch of people. You mentioned Indigenous communities, but within our own context, there are many other things that are both health issues and social issues. So social justice, health justice, all of those elements. And you do have to unpack it to be able to have the conversation. But there is something about generosity, about compassion, about moral justice, about morality, about how we want to live. And when you raise the example of AIDS, such a good example of why did we not see that? Why did that not matter in terms of who we were ignoring? Who was the population that was infected? So I love this conversation. I thank both of you for your thoughts, but it's just, there's something we're missing about how to reframe what our responsibilities, our collective responsibilities are. And we've moved so far away from collective interest and so focused on individual interest. Why is it about business? Is it about care when we talk about health? And if it's about a business, it's a whole different discussion than care. So anyway, I'm rambling a little bit, but I think there's so much in what we've talked about tonight that merits some more exploration.
I might add that, I gave these examples that kind of are on a pretty big international frame. But I think, just as I think you're saying, Lynn, this applies internationally and it applies locally. And we can think about our own lives and our own work, no matter in what sphere, and what are the economic and social relationships in which we operate, and do we really see all the people that we need to see? Are they visible enough? And is there injustice that needs to be dealt with? Are there Shmita style moves that we ought to be making? I think Shmita is challenging us to kind of think radically.
To follow up on what Lynn was saying, I was actually thinking this when Jamie was speaking about, how the governments of the richer countries started taking care of their citizens economically. And Canada we'll give you $2,000 a month if you are working. However, if you had been disabled and on social assistance and receiving usually $1,000 or less a month, then you were not eligible. And the excuse was that your province is already taking care of you. Our provinces are taking care of disabled people very badly, but that was not at all considered or even examined. And it's not that our federal government didn't have the information about it. It's that they chose not to engage with it, which very starkly pointed to, non-disabled people need $2,000 a month. Disabled people who usually have higher expenses can live on air, apparently. And as I was thinking about it, and how that can be fixed, I keep coming back to like small steps. I have a friend who every time she encounters something like this, writes an email. She finds the person to write to, and then she writes an email. And she knows that by herself, she might not accomplish anything. But if enough people did that, we might. If enough people wrote to either our federal government or our provincial government and were, how about raising rates for disabled people and in general, people receiving social assistance because they are absolutely not livable? How about that? Maybe if they got 1,000 emails, it could change. I'm throwing that out there because often people say, oh, that's really terrible. And then the conversation stops there. And I would like people to have like one action that they take as a result of learning about a terrible thing. It doesn't have to be a big thing. But just every time you hear about a bad thing like this, something that is not meeting our Shmita standards, like think of a small thing or a large thing, if you are able to do just then, that would make a difference.
Thank you, Camila.
Amy, can I throw out something that I'd love to hear you comment on? It's been a really interesting, stimulating conversation. Shmita really, I think, has a lot of appeal in so much as it's a way of achieving change by recognizing obligations. But isn't the fundamental tension in our world now that in the system we live in a kind of neoliberal capitalist system, there's nothing really in that fundamentally recognizes obligation? I mean, the theory is very much that in a capitalist system, enough wealth is generated and hopefully enough people benefit by it, et cetera, et cetera. We've seen such a shift away from that, so much inequity that's growing globally, that how do we kind of reconcile obligation as a solution when probably we need governance and regulation, but we're in a situation where the bodies that might achieve that in civil society don't play a strong enough role. So I guess my question really is, how do we kind of achieve some kind of balance between this sense of obligation that I think would be wonderful to implement in our society with the real need for addressing our problems through governance, through regulation, through systemic change?
I think we need the latter big time. If you think of the example, how did it happen with AIDS? It happened because people were mobilized. Civil societies were mobilized. Some governments were mobilized, like the government of Brazil was remarkable in that stretch. People were mobilized, and I think we're going to have to mobilize a lot. I think we can be informed by a sense of justice and a sense of obligations. I don't think these are in opposition to each other, but we need mobilization very badly. If the disaster of the pandemic and of climate change doesn't rattle us into moving, I don't know what will, but I feel like we've just got to get going. I love what Karen said. You could, small ripples can add up. The age of that was a big, that seemed to move a mountain. It really did. At the time, it was remarkable. Those of us who said, "How is this going?" But it did. It's not impossible to to have new structures, but it's going to require social and political movements.
I just put in the chat a quotation from Sefer HaChinuch, which is a code of law written in the 13th century in Spain, anonymously. And it says, "It is from the root of the commandment, that is, to strengthen and fix the trait of generosity in our hearts, and to completely distance the trait of stinginess." And Rick, I'm very compelled by the question that you asked about a sense of obligation. Where does that come from? How do we teach and generate a sense of mutual obligation, that and that our responsibility for one another and for collective well-being is more important than financial gain? That is a whole value system. That's what I think religious community does. Other organizing bodies that put at its center our profound interdependence and the obligations that stem from it. But that has to be taught and cultivated as the axis around which we function, and to practice it in all kinds of ways on a regular basis, because it is a state of mind and state of heart, and shapes how we see, who we don't see. So I feel like I want to walk away holding that as an ongoing question. What will nurture a sense of mutual obligation? What can strengthen and grow our capacity for generosity over our maybe very human instinct to be stingy, to own, to claim as mine, to see my gain requires your loss, and if you gain, then it means my loss. A sort of zero-sum framing, as opposed to a framing that sees our interrelationship and our mutual thriving as fundamentally what we are here for. And with that, dear friends, I want to turn it over to our board member, Sarah Green, to share some thanks.
Oh my goodness, my brain is exploding as I speak. I've got so many thoughts. I couldn't even ask questions or articulate anything because everything that was shared was just incredibly thought-provoking and valuable by both you, Jamie, and Rabbi Miriam, and everyone who asked questions and had so much to contribute. And I do just want to say thank you for helping us to start this conversation in a different kind of way, in a different context. I just think, Rabbi Miriam, too, about like the Shmita Year, and think, how can we start thinking about the values, the philosophy of the Shmita Year, and how it gets taken in through every year. So thank you for this. Again, thank you, James, for joining us and sharing your really valuable experiences with us, and for your teachings, Rabbi Miriam, and for Sharon, for bringing us all together and starting us off.
Thank you so much. And thank you to Karen for being our Zoom host.
As
Jamie,
always.
Thanks, everyone.
Jamie, what a
Thanks,
treat
Jamie.
to be with you. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for being here.